Chapter 24. Camp. John Hamman, 24. Cretaceous. John ran his hands over the great body. It was the largest living thing he had ever seen in his life. Well, it had been living. Even in death, it was a wonder. The heart still tried to beat, and the last of its blood flowed like a waterfall down its side over his hand. It was warm in the rapidly cooling night air. John looked at his hand, almost black, in the last fading light. Wasn't that wrong? He thought they were cold-blooded reptiles. Shouldn't their blood be cold, like some giant snake or lizard? He laid his head against the great chest, feeling the warmth of the body and listening to the final beats of its heart. Manny returned to the camp to fetch the porters. They had heard the gun, and 6 of them met him at the edge of the wood. They took a picture with the camera on a tripod, all of them with the dinosaur. John stood by the head, which they propped up so you could see its strange shape. Manny stood on his right, and the Maasai on his left, with the porters lined up behind the body to their left. John posed with the big gun. The flash was tremendous, blinding them all. John thought this scared his men more than anything else that day. Butchering took them well into the night and was done by lantern light. They saved the head, though he had no idea what to do with it. They took the meat for the camp. The porters had to cut poles to carry it, as if one leg were a full-size animal. It was late as they marched back into camp, singing. John was even beginning to learn some of the words. This was apparently very amusing to the crew. Tents were set up in a circle, and a fire burning smokily in the middle. They could see it as soon as they left the woods as a guide home. A camp chair and a plate of roast dinosaur from the little hens they shot earlier that day were waiting for John in front of the fire. It was lean like a game bird and tasted mostly like chicken. A reptile should taste stranger than that, but he'd never seen a reptile with feathers. Were these damn things birds? John broke out a bottle of the whiskey. That was what he really needed. A large glass of that put everything right. He must thank Blix. It even helped the pain in his shoulder. He stumbled to his tent, settled down on the small cot, and blew out the lamp. He was out before his head hit the pillow. The next morning, light was streaming in through the tent flaps, but John swore he had only barely dozed off to sleep. He was awakened by Manny, gently shaking his shoulder.
Come, Warner.
John was still looking around in confusion as Manny turned and left the tent. The whiskey may have helped his shoulder, but it had not been kind to his head. John managed to sit on the edge of the cot. That bastard! He was going to kill Blix. John looked down at himself. He really must stop sleeping in his clothes. He realized he had been wearing the same clothes on the ship before he'd even set foot on this continent. He had worn the same suit on the train ride to Nairobi. He'd still been wearing it when Blix had dragged him out on this adventure, and he'd been wearing them yesterday when they hunted a dinosaur. He'd yet to even remove them. Had all that happened in 48 hours? John started to leave the tent, but retreated back inside upon facing the glaring sun. He found his hat and tried again. Was the sun brighter in this time? Surely it had never been so bright before. The little camp was busy. The crew had built racks and was smoking meat over a fire. Manny, the finest person in all creation, appeared with a steaming cup of coffee. John sat on the camp chair in front of the tent and tried to get his bearings. He poured a bit of the whiskey from the bottle he found beside the chair into the cup, and the world got a little better. John stared at the bottle. How had the level gotten so low? He shook his head and set it back down beside the chair in what seemed to be its home. Manny appeared once more before John with the Maasai.
Warner, he say you come. Bring gun. Big animal.
John tried to focus on Manny, asking,
What kind of animal?
he quickly realized this was a truly useless question. The man could have no knowledge of the animals in this time, but to John's surprise, he got an answer.
He say big elephant. Giraffe eat trees. He call it Mokele Mbembe.
It would seem they were already naming the wildlife here. John pushed himself to his feet.
Bring guns. Let's go see Mokele Mbembe.
He carried the double this time, not sure what they might be walking up on. They headed to the right along the tree line and walked for some time. John heard it before he saw it. Sounds of cracking, crashing, and ripping. He saw the top of a tree shake. They came over a small rise and saw them. There were 3 of the beasts. 2 were what John hoped was full-grown, and 1 was slightly smaller. One of the big ones had ripped a sizable limb off a large tree and was chewing on it. Another took a large bite out of the top of what John could only describe as a palm tree and was chewing on the foliage. John could not begin to describe the size. They were quadrupeds. They had long necks and long tails. They must have been 100 feet long. Their legs were like tree trunks. The barrel of their chests must have been 25 feet in diameter. The Maasai led them forward. They walked almost up to them. Any closer, and John would not have been able to see them. As it was, he had to crane his neck and turn from side to side to take the beast in. They completely ignored the humans. They were ants in comparison. The Maasai seemed to know this instinctively. John wanted to touch one. How could anything be so enormous? They never stopped eating. He walked up to it slowly. Well, he walked up to one of its legs. It was round, like a barrel, but bigger than a tree. He reached out, and the skin felt slightly rough, almost pebbly, like the skin of an elephant. John thought it might squash him for having the temerity to touch it uninvited like that. One of them lifted onto its hind legs, balancing on its tail to reach the new growth at the top of the tree. It ripped and tore at the limb, and then the body came down. When the forelegs struck, the ground shook. John retreated for fear of being turned to jelly beneath their feet by accident. Manny was staring at John wide-eyed. They all backed away. It was easier to observe them from a bit more of a distance. They were going to need bigger guns. Much bigger guns. John did not think they could scratch, much less kill one of those things. He could not imagine even the 500 penetrating deep enough to reach the heart of that thing, even if he did know where to aim. He thought of how thick the bones must be. How could they ever do enough damage to bring one down? They returned to camp about midday. John's stomach was ready for a real meal. He sat down once again in his camp chair, and magically a plate appeared with a steak and potatoes. John thanked the man as best he could, but the man simply smiled and backed away. He couldn't understand a thing John said, but must have understood the sentiment. The steak was good, richer, and less like chicken, but it was still a pale meat, not red like a cow. John was feeling much better. He thought they were doing quite well. He asked Manny if they could find some smaller game, since Mokele Mbembe was too big. Manny went off to consult with the Maasai. John dug into his pack and pulled out another of his little treasures that he had salvaged from the war. It was an oversized holster, longer than a proper handgun. The leather holster was attached to a wooden board of the same shape. He opened the flap and drew out his prize, a Luger pistol with a long barrel. It had an adjustable sight, like a rifle. It was chambered in 9mm parabellum, which the Germans had favored. John loaded the 2 magazines. The interesting thing about this weapon was that you could slide the end of the piece of wood that was the backing of the holster into a dovetail on the back of the grip of the pistol, and then you had a tiny automatic rifle. John threw a thin belt over his neck, and he had a handy little weapon. He came back out of the tent to find Manny and the Maasai waiting for him. John took the carabiner from him and put it over his shoulder. They would see what they could find. The Maasai turned and took off at a jog. They followed along behind at a more leisurely pace. John had no illusions about being able to run all day across the plains. They skirted the edge of the forest and walked a good distance. They saw the tracker squatting behind a large fern with a short, barrel-shaped trunk. John stopped and studied the land in front of them. Finally, he spotted movement. A small group of dinosaurs was ahead of them, feeding among the ground cover. They appeared to be herbivores, four-legged and more balanced than the one they shot before. They were shorter than John at the shoulder and not as heavily built as the previous kill. Their necks were not as long, and the heads lacked the long extension back over the neck. They had long tails that they held out almost straight and could raise higher off the ground. For some reason, John got the impression they were not fully grown. Were these adolescents? They didn't have any feathers that he could see. The hunters shifted to come up behind the cover that the Maasai was squatting behind. As they knelt, John thought about what to do. He counted 11 in the group. Maybe this was a chance to change things up a bit. He figured the group could spare a couple of its members. Crouching low, he moved toward the animals, trying to keep a patch of cover between them. He moved as quietly as he could, the ground soft and sandy beneath his feet. He started around the patch of ferns to the left. Manny, as always, followed John. The Maasai moved to the right. They were close. John could hear them call out to one another, the sound not nearly as deep and resonant as the dinosaur the night before. They were just ahead. John looked back at Manny, who smiled broadly back. Holding the stock of the Luger into his shoulder, John stepped out from around the corner. They were about 30 yards from the animals. John put 2 rounds into the side of the nearest one and then switched targets, putting 3 more into the next. Both dropped. John saw movement to the side, and a spear flew through the air and struck another in the neck. The injured dinosaur backed up, trying to get away from its enemy. It tried to bite at the spear, but could not turn its shorter head enough to grasp the shaft. It stumbled, its forelegs collapsing under it, as blood poured from the junction of its neck and shoulder. Its rear legs dropped as well, and then with a bellow, it rolled on its side, the spear pointing into the air. The rest of the little herd pounded off across the plain. They had meat from last night, but might be able to turn this into something else. They still didn't know much about this place or the creatures that inhabited it. They now had a little bait, and John was curious what it might bring. Examining the kills closer, they had what looked like a beak filled with flat teeth. The forefeet had large claws. Could they be used for digging? They retreated to the edge of the forest where it was shady and cool to see what the day would bring. That put them about 200 yards from the bait. If John stood behind a tree, he could see one clearly and the tops of the other 2. He stowed the Luger back in its holster. He extended the strap and hung it around his shoulder so it hung behind his hip, out of the way. He took up the Mauser and checked the chamber, and then moved the sight up a notch to the 200-meter mark. It was a fine gun. John carried an Enfield in the war, of course, but the 8mm was a bigger cartridge. He liked this shorter gun that he had liberated from a guard at a rail station. Unlike the normal service rifle, it had fit nicely in his duffel. The hunters all made themselves comfortable and prepared to wait. John was fine, with a more relaxed pace after the last 2 days. He sat there chewing on a bit of jerky. He wasn't sure what was in it, but it was spicy, and the salt satisfied a need within him. Late in the afternoon, they began to get some attention. Buzzards started to circle, but they did not look like any birds John knew. Soon, 2 of them were circling above the bait. They were much bigger than any birds he had ever seen. John could not get an accurate sense of scale, looking up into the sky. As they got closer, John's estimate only got bigger. When they landed, he was utterly shocked. They were bigger than the planes in the war. Still, even after they landed and folded their wings in, they must have stood 20 feet tall to the top of their heads. Each had a long neck, and the head was enormous with a crest on top of the skull. The head alone was longer than John was tall. The wings were more like a bat. The animals did not stand on their rear legs like a bird with their wings folded. Instead, leaning forward on them at the elbow in the wing like a bat would. John could see no feathers, reinforcing that bat-like impression. For all of their size, the body was not all that heavy. John supposed there must be limits if it were to become airborne. Still, the scale of the things. They bent down and started to tear at the kills. John took aim at the larger one. When it lifted its head, with half a dinosaur in its beak exposing its chest, he fired. The winged beast staggered, dropping the carcass from its mouth, and let out a loud cawing noise. John cycled the bolt and fired again. The other feasting dinosaur looked at the sound of the shot and turned to take off. John stared, speechless at what followed. He had seen an albatross take off once, and this made that display look graceful. It faced into the wind and began this lumbering hop that ended with its back legs desperately trying to keep up, running across the ground as the wings made 3 desperate flaps before it lumbered into the air. Even then, John was convinced it would crash before it gained enough altitude for its ridiculously long wings to get a full sweep. He stared at the thing, slowly gaining altitude as it disappeared in the distance. Only then did he turn back to see the first still flailing on the ground. He put a third bullet in its chest, and it finally went still. All 3 of the men approached and circled all the way around the creature, studying it. They still couldn't grasp what they were looking at. It was on its back at this point. They grabbed the wings and stretched them out. The length was huge. The wings had a membrane like a bat. They only had bone on the leading edge. At the elbow of the wing was a clawed hand. That was what it stood on, and then a single bone extended to the wingtip. He sent the men back to the camp. Manny brought the camera. They had to back up to get the whole thing in frame as the men held the wings out. They took another picture with John posing with the head. It was indeed bigger than him by more than 2 feet. John tried to get one of the men to lay down in the mouth as if he was being eaten by it. He could not persuade any of them to pose for that picture. They harvested meat from what remained of the kills they made earlier and took the head, which took 2 men to carry, and they butchered what they could from the corpse. The bones were incredibly light. John noticed that some of the men brought those back as well. He wasn't sure what they were going to do with all the trophies.